All right, welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going deep on, well, uh, something pretty essential if you're working with Microsoft Azure.
Absolutely. We're talking about Azure Resource Manager, or as it's more commonly known, ARM.
And for this deep dive, we're turning to a great source, Bossil's Knowledge Bunker. The information we've gathered for this deep dive, well, let's just say, it's going to give you a shortcut to really understanding ARM, making your Azure experience, hopefully, way smoother and more effective.
Definitely less overwhelming, too.
Huh.
We're breaking it all down. Terminology, deployment methods, the tools you'll use, plus all the crucial considerations based on what we have here.
So buckle up, folks, because we're diving right into the heart of Azure Resource Manager, starting with, well, let's call it slide one.
Slide 1, yeah. Understanding Azure Resource Manager. Gets right to the point, doesn't it?
Okay, so at its core, ARM is the service for deploying and managing those Azure resources, all of them.
It's the underlying layer, the real brains of the operation. Anything you do in Azure, really anything, goes through ARM. Spinning up a virtual machine, tweaking a database, even taking down an old application.
Right, so whether you're clicking away in the portal, using some fancy command line tool, or even writing code with an SDK, it all goes through ARM first.
That's right. And here's the interesting part. ARM actually verifies it's you making the request. Make sure you're who you say you are.
Security first, I see.
And it checks that you actually have permission to do whatever it is you're trying to do.
Ah, so it's not just about getting things done, it's about doing them securely and in a controlled way, making sure everything in your Azure account is managed consistently, right?
You got it. It's a single, reliable pathway for all your management operations. The key takeaway here is ARM isn't just some optional add-on. It's built into the very foundation of Azure management. It's the bedrock. So what we're trying to do with this first part is really make sure you understand that. See ARM as the essential mechanism that makes effective Azure management possible.
Okay, I think we've laid a good foundation there. So now let's jump into some of those key terms you mentioned earlier. Slide 2, if you will.
Slide 2, key Azure Resource Manager terminology. And the first one up is resource. Now, this one's pretty broad. Basically, a resource is any manageable item in the entire Azure platform.
Manageable item, huh? Like what kind of things are we talking about here?
Well, the slide gives a few good examples to get us started. Virtual machines, which are basically your computers in the cloud. Then there's storage accounts where you keep all your data.
And web apps. That's the infrastructure for your online applications, right?
Exactly. Plus databases for managing all that structured information. And of course, we can't forget virtual networks. Those are kind of like the nervous system connecting everything together.
Right, but those are just a few examples, right? Because Azure is a huge platform. There's got to be a ton more than just that.
Oh, absolutely. We're just scratching the surface here. Azure has everything from AI and machine learning services to IoT hubs and way beyond. But all of these, every single one, is considered a resource managed by ARM.
Wow, that's a lot to keep track of, which is probably why we have the next term, resource group.
Resource group. Yeah, it's a logical way to group all those resources together, especially the ones that are part of the same Azure solution.
The key word there being logical, right? It's about organization, how you want to arrange things.
Precisely. That's where the real power of resource groups comes in. You could, for example, group all the pieces of a specific application together. So you'd have your VM, your database, your storage, all neatly bundled.
Makes sense. So it's all in one place. But I guess you could also organize them based on like who's responsible for them. Like if you have different teams managing different parts of the infrastructure.
Absolutely. You could organize them by team ownership or even by their life cycle, grouping resources that are, typically deployed, updated, and retired together. Think of resource groups less like folders and more like units of management. Makes everything smoother from billing to retirement. It's really all about you, giving you the freedom to organize your Azure environment in a way that makes sense.
Keeps things clean and manageable. I like it. Okay, last term on this slide, resource provider. This one sounds a bit more technical. What's that all about?
So resource providers, they're like the behind-the-scenes guys. They're the back-end services that actually supply those Azure resources we've been talking about. They're the ones that know how to create and manage specific types of resources.
Okay, so if I wanted to spin up a new virtual machine, there's a specific resource provider that handles that.
Right. For VMs, it would be Microsoft.compute. They're the ones with all the logic and know how to get those VMs up and running.
And what about storage accounts? Is there a different one for that?
Yep, that'd be Microsoft.storage. And for web apps, you're looking at Microsoft.web. Basically, each category of Azure resources has its own dedicated resource provider. That's how Azure keeps all those services organized and manageable.
All right, so just to recap, we've got resource, the individual building block resource group to organize them logically, and resource provider, the behind-the-scenes service that makes it all happen.
Got it. So on to slide 3, I think. This is where we start getting into the actual deployment process.
Slide 3, understanding ARM templates. That's right. We're moving from concepts to how you actually build and deploy your infrastructure in Azure.
And the star of the show here is ARM templates. What exactly are these templates?
So ARM templates, they're all about infrastructure as code. They're files written in a format called JSON, which stands for JavaScript Object Notation. It's a way to define the resources you want in your Azure environment all in one place.
So instead of clicking around in the portal and configuring each resource manually, you describe everything in a template file. Exactly. You specify the types of resources you need, all their configurations, even the dependencies between them. It's a complete blueprint of your Azure environment.
Okay, that makes sense. And the slide mentions declarative syntax. Now, I'm not a hardcore coder, so can you explain that in simpler terms?
Sure. Declarative syntax basically means you're telling Azure what you want your final infrastructure to look like. You're defining the end goal. You don't have to give step-by-step instructions on how to get there.
So it's like saying, I want a house with 3 bedrooms and a big backyard, and then letting the construction crew figure out the blueprints and the actual building process.
Exactly. You define the what, and Azure handles the how. It figures out all the underlying steps to create those resources and configure them according to your specifications.
Got it. That sounds a lot easier than writing out every little command. And speaking of making things easier, the slide also talks about consistent deployments. Why is that so important?
Oh, consistency is crucial, especially when you're managing cloud infrastructure at any scale. Think about it. If you have to deploy the same set of resources multiple times, say, for development, testing, and production environments, you want them to be exactly the same.
Right. Otherwise, you could run into all sorts of problems.
Right.
Inconsistent configurations, weird bugs. It'd be a nightmare.
Exactly. And that's where ARM templates really shine. Since they're just text files, you can manage them using version control systems like Git, just like you manage your application code. So you have a complete history of your infrastructure definitions. You can track changes, revert to previous versions if needed. It's really powerful.
So you're always deploying the same configuration, no matter what environment you're working in. That's a huge time saver and a big relief for anyone who's ever dealt with those annoying inconsistencies.
Definitely. And there's another big advantage: troubleshooting. If a deployment hits a snag, ARM templates usually give you really detailed error messages. It's way easier to figure out what went wrong and fix it.
And once you've fixed the template, you can redeploy it knowing it's going to work consistently every single time. It's a huge efficiency gain. Okay, let's move on to slide 4, which seems to be about those resource groups we talked about earlier.
Slide 4. Resource group considerations. And this is all about the best practices for using them effectively. Because even though they're flexible, there are still some rules and guidelines you need to keep in mind.
Makes sense. So what are some of these resource group rules we need to know about?
First off, one resource can only belong to a single resource group at a time. It's a one-to-one relationship, no sharing allowed.
Simple enough. What else?
This one's important. Once you've created a resource group, you can't change its name. So choose wisely, think it through, make sure it's descriptive and something you can live with long term.
That's a good tip. So what about the types of resources you can put in a group? Can they be all mixed up, or do they have to be the same type? And what about location? Can they be in different Azure regions?
A single resource group can absolutely contain a diverse mix of resource types. You could have a virtual machine, a SQL database, and a web app all hanging out together if that makes sense for your organization. And here's the cool part. They don't even have to be in the same region. You could have your main resource group in, say, the US East region, but include a backup storage account located in Europe West for disaster recovery purposes. It's totally up to you.
Interesting. So the resource group is a logical grouping, not tied to any specific physical location. Makes sense. Now, the slide also mentions something called lifecycle management. What's that all about?
Lifecycle management. It's a best practice. The idea is that all the resources within a resource group should share the same lifecycle, meaning they're deployed together, updated together, and when the time comes, retired or deleted together. Makes managing your Azure solutions a whole lot easier.
Makes sense. So if you're decommissioning an entire application, you can just delete the whole resource group and everything goes away cleanly. No need to track down individual resources and delete them separately.
Exactly. It's much cleaner and far less error-prone. It's about seeing resource groups as more than just containers. They're units of management and lifecycle, streamlining everything from setup to shutdown.
That's a very elegant way to think about it. Now, the last thing on this slide is permission scoping. How do resource groups help us manage who can do what in Azure?
Permission scoping. It's all about simplifying access control. Instead of granting permissions to each individual resource, which could be a huge headache, you can assign them at the resource group level.
So if I have a team of developers working on a specific project, I can give them access to the entire resource group for that project.
Exactly. And any new resources added to that group will automatically inherit those permissions, so you don't have to go back and reconfigure everything each time. It makes managing access a lot more efficient.
Streamlines things significantly. All right, moving right along. Slide 5, Resource Manager locks. These sound like a very welcome safety feature.
Resource Manager locks are all about preventing those oops moments. They're there to protect your important Azure resources from accidental deletion or modification. Think of them as your safety net in the cloud. They take the worry out of accidental deletion and turn it into a managed exception.
So if I'm super worried about accidentally deleting a critical database, I can slap a lock on it.
You got it.
Right.
And there are two main types of locks, read-only and delete. The names are pretty self-explanatory, I think.
I think I can figure those out.
Yeah,
So a read-only lock prevents any changes, and a delete lock prevents, well, deletion.
exactly. Read-only means no one, not even admins, can change the configuration. They can still see the settings, but can't touch them. A delete lock prevents the resource from being deleted, but you can still modify its settings.
And you can apply these locks at different levels, right? Not just to individual resources.
You can apply them at the subscription level, the resource group level, or even to a specific resource. Gives you lots of flexibility depending on your needs.
I like options. Now, what about lock inheritance? Does that mean if I lock a resource group, everything inside it gets locked down too?
Exactly. Locks inherit down the hierarchy. So a delete lock on a resource group protects everything inside it. All the VMs, databases, storage accounts, everything. It's a really handy way to ensure consistent protection.
Makes sense. So it cascades down, protecting everything in the group. But I imagine there's some control over who can actually apply or remove these locks, right? You wouldn't want just anyone messing with those.
Of course not. Only users with specific Azure roles like owner or user access administrator can manage those locks. It ensures that only authorized people have that level of control.
Makes perfect sense. All right, on to slide 6, moving resources between groups. So let's say we've got our resources neatly organized into groups, but then our needs change and we need to shuffle things around a bit. Can we do that?
Moving resources between groups is definitely possible. As your Azure environment grows and evolves, you might need to reorganize things, and the moving process allows you to do just that. You can move resources to different groups or even different subscriptions altogether. And ARM takes care of everything behind the scenes.
So it's not like I have to manually recreate resources in a new group.
No, not at all. You initiate the move, and ARM handles the rest. But here's a crucial detail. During the move, ARM temporarily locks both the source and the target resource groups. This is to prevent any changes or deletions while the move is in progress.
So it's like a temporary freeze to ensure everything moves smoothly and consistently. Smart. But what about the services running on those resources? Will my applications experience downtime during the move?
For most Azure resources, the answer is no. The lock mainly affects the management side of things, not the actual services running on those resources. So things like VMs, web apps, and databases should continue running without interruption. This service continuity is a big deal in Azure. They try to minimize disruptions as much as possible during management operations.
That's a huge relief. Nobody wants unexpected outages just because they're reorganizing their infrastructure. But are there any limitations on what types of resources can be moved?
Yes, there are some limitations. Not all Azure resource types support the move operation, so it's always best to check the official documentation. There is a page called Move Operation Support for Resources, which lists all the resource types that can be moved, along with any specific prerequisites or potential gotchas you should be aware of.
It's always a good idea to check the docs before making any big moves. All right, moving on to slide 7, resource deletion and limits. Time to face the inevitable, saying goodbye to our resources.
It's part of the life cycle. And when it comes to deleting resources, you have a couple of options. You can delete individual resources through the Azure portal, just navigate to the resource and click delete. Or if you're dealing with an entire solution, you can delete the whole resource group.
And that'll get rid of all the resources within that group, right? A clean sweep.
Exactly. It's an all or nothing kind of deal. And just to prevent any accidental deletions, Azure always asks for confirmation. You usually have to type the name of the resource or group you want to delete, or click through a confirmation prompt.
That confirmation step is much appreciated. I can imagine some heart-stopping moments if you accidentally deleted the wrong thing.
Absolutely. The slide also mentions PowerShell deletion. For those who prefer the command line, you can delete entire resource groups using Azure PowerShell. The command is remove as resource group, followed by the name of the group you want to delete.
So it's the same outcome, just a different method.
Right.
Got it. Now, the slide brings up something called dependency awareness.
Right.
Why is that so important when deleting resources?
Dependency awareness is crucial. Before you hit that delete button, you need to understand what other resources might be relying on the one you're about to delete. It might be another resource in the same group, or even one in a different group or subscription. It could even be an external service. Deleting something without considering these dependencies can cause all sorts of problems: outages, application failures, data loss, the whole 9 yards.
Sounds like it's worth taking a moment to map out those dependencies, especially in more complex environments.
Absolutely. Better safe than sorry. And speaking of things to be aware of, let's talk about resource limits. Azure has limits on how many resources you can create within a subscription.
Right, like how much storage you can have, how many virtual machines you can spin up, that kind of thing.
Exactly. These limits are there to prevent any one user from hogging all the resources and to ensure fair usage for everyone. The good news is Azure lets you see how much you're using against these limits, usually right in the portal. So you can keep an eye on things and plan accordingly.
And what if you hit a limit? Can you do anything about that?
If you anticipate needing more of a certain resource, you can submit a support request to Microsoft and ask for a limit increase. They're usually pretty good about accommodating reasonable requests. And it's worth noting that all Azure resources have documented maximum limits. So do your research and plan ahead to avoid any surprises.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
All right, let's move on to the tools we can use to manage all this. Slide 8, Azure Portal and Cloud Shell. I think most people who've used Azure are at least somewhat familiar with the Azure Portal.
Azure Portal is like the central command center. It's a web-based interface where you can manage pretty much every aspect of your Azure environment. It's graphical, so it's very user-friendly. You can build, configure, monitor, manage, all without writing a single line of code.
So it's a good place to get a visual overview of your resources and do some hands-on management. And the slide also mentions the Azure mobile app. That sounds handy for those of us who are always on the go.
The mobile app is great. It's available for both iOS and Android, and it lets you keep an eye on your Azure resources even when you're away from your computer. You can check for alerts, see how your resources are doing, even take some actions like restarting a VM or a web app. It's pretty powerful for managing things remotely.
Now that's what I call mobile computing. All right, let's talk about Azure Cloud Shell. What's the deal with that?
Azure Cloud Shell is a really cool feature. It's basically a shell environment, either Bash or PowerShell, that you can access right in your web browser.
So it's like having a command line in the cloud.
Exactly. And here's the best part. It automatically authenticates you to your Azure subscription. So no need to log in separately every time you want to run a command. Plus, it runs on a temporary Azure container, which means it's secure and automatically managed.
Sounds very convenient.
Mm-hmm.
Especially if you're comfortable working with command line tools.
It is, and you don't have to install anything on your local machine. It comes preloaded with a bunch of useful command line tools for managing Azure resources, great for quick admin tasks, running scripts, anything you need to do from the command line, really.
All right, on to our final slide, slide 9, Azure PowerShell and CLI. These are for the more code-savvy folks out there, right?
Right. We're moving into the realm of automation and scripting, and Azure PowerShell is the first one up. It's basically a set of modules that add Azure-specific commands to the PowerShell scripting language. These commands are called CMDlets.
So if you're already familiar with PowerShell, you can use those CMDlets to manage your Azure resources.
Exactly. You can write scripts to automate pretty much anything you can do in the portal. You can create virtual machines, get information about your storage accounts, all sorts of stuff.
And is Azure PowerShell something you need to install separately?
Well, it's available in Cloud Shell, so you can use it right there in your browser. But you can also install it on your own computer, whether it's Windows, Mac OS, or Linux. That way you can run your scripts locally.
And the slide actually outlines the steps for installation, doesn't it?
It does. If you want to install it on Windows, you'll need to open PowerShell as an administrator and use the install module command, specifying the name of the Azure PowerShell module, which is as. PowerShell will then download and install everything you need. Once that's done, you can connect to your Azure subscription using the Connect As account CMDLet. You'll need to authenticate with your Azure credentials, and then you can run the Get As subscription CMDLet to verify that you're connected to the right subscription.
Awesome. Okay, now, last but not least, we've got the Azure CLI. How is that different from PowerShell?
Azure CLI, or Command Line Interface, is another command line tool for managing Azure. But unlike PowerShell, which is very Windows-centric, the CLI is designed to work on any operating system.
So if you're working on Linux or Mac OS, the CLI is a good option, but it's also available for Windows, right?
Right, it's cross-platform, so you can use it anywhere. The commands are a bit different from PowerShell. They usually follow the format as resource action options. So, for example, to create a virtual machine, you might use a command like asvm create.
So it's a different syntax,
Yeah.
but the goal is the same, managing your Azure infrastructure from the command line. I guess it really comes down to personal preference and what you're already familiar with.
Exactly. Whether you prefer the visual approach of the portal, the scripting power of PowerShell, or the cross-platform flexibility of the CLI, Azure gives you the tools you need. And ultimately, they all talk to the same underlying service, Azure Resource Manager.
It's all connected. All right, well, that was a lot of information. We've covered a ton of ground today, delving into the depths of Azure Resource Manager. Just to recap, we learned that ARM is the brain behind Azure management. It handles everything from deployment to security to lifecycle management. We also discussed the key terms you need to know, like resources, resource groups, and resource providers. And we explored the power of ARM templates for automating deployments and ensuring consistency. We talked about how to use resource groups effectively, including things like lifecycle management and permission scoping. And of course, we covered the importance of resource locks for protecting your critical assets. We even touched on moving and deleting resources and those all-important resource limits.
We also looked at the various tools you can use to manage Azure, from the user-friendly portal to the powerful command line tools like PowerShell and the CLI. It's all about finding what works best for you and your workflow.
The key takeaway here for anyone listening is that understanding the fundamentals of Azure Resource Manager is essential for effectively managing your Azure environment. It takes away a lot of the mystery and makes the whole process feel less overwhelming.
With a solid understanding of ARM, you can approach Azure management with more confidence and control.
Absolutely. So I hope this deep dive has given you the knowledge and tools you need to make the most of your Azure experience. Now that you know all this about Azure Resource Manager, I encourage you to think about how you can apply these concepts to your own projects. How can you organize your resources more effectively? What can you automate? What new possibilities does this understanding unlock for you? Thanks for joining us for the deep dive.